I am jealous of your wood paneling, Adam. That's a very distinguished background you have here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Adam Foreman. I am sorry about that. That's the YouTube stream starting. All right. So my name is Dr. Adam Foreman. I'm the executive director here at Shadows in New Iberia, Louisiana. Um, we are we host three public program series every year. And tonight we're starting our Faith and Freedom series, where we explore um, how religion and faith and tradition guides freedom movements from abolition to civil rights and even the modern day Black Lives Matter movement. In June, we're hosting the Faith and Freedom Symposium with keynote speaker Dr. Cody Roberts of Louisiana State University. In July, we're welcoming Kenneth Hoffman from the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience to explore the role of Southern Jewish communities during civil rights. And if you can't make it in person, all of our programs are broadcast live via Zoom. They're archived on YouTube. And for more information, you can visit us at shadowsontheteche.org. The Faith and Freedom series is supported by the state of Louisiana and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight, we're welcoming Dr. Ben Wright. Dr. Wright is an associate professor of history and the director of the Open U.S. History Lab at the University of Texas at Dallas. He's author or editor of 5 books, including the one we're talking about tonight, which is Bonds of Salvation. You can order a signed copy of his book and support the Shadows at the same time through our website. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the program. To do so, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So, Ben, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Adam. Yeah, thanks to Adam, thanks to Jade for their work with Shadows and the invitation to talk about a book that, frankly, I haven't thought about that much for about 8 years, but it's wonderful to revisit it, and I'm really thrilled. I also want to thank anybody who's logging on and joining. Keep an eye on the remarkable programming going on at Shadows. It sounds like the next series will be on fashion. So, man, if religion is a little dull for you, stick around for some fashion coming later this year. So historians answer questions. That's what we do. And there is one question that has woken me up in the middle of the night, really for most of my life. And that question is, how has Christianity shaped the way that Americans understand and respond to racial injustice? So if that's a question that you're preoccupied by, obviously American slavery is something that you have to consider and address. So as I began kind of my career as a historian, I was obsessing over this question and was poring over the writings of various American religious leaders, trying to see if I could find something new to say about a topic that admittedly a lot of folks have written about. And in many ways, this book started when I was in the archive and I met a itinerant Methodist minister named Joshua Marsden. I was doing my thing I do as a historian, which is be creepy and read dead people's diaries and dead people's mail. And I came upon this passage in Marsden's diary that he wrote in 1814. And the passage opens the introduction. I hope you don't mind, I'm going to read from it. Marsden wrote, "Never go to the southern states of America. They are polluted with slavery, and slavery is the most demoralizing thing under the sun. It is the parent of oppression, the nurse of sloth and guilty passions. It is the bane of man, the abomination of God. Where slavery reigns, a human being is made a beast of burden or a slave of lust. The poor, half-famished Negro trembles at a tyrant's nod and loses every good quality in the servility of a drudge or the wickedness of a prostitute. Oh, that the scandal of humanity were annihilated." Now, I'll tell you, I have read a lot of anti-slavery sentiments, and for 1814, that is truly one of the loudest, most uncompromising, most morally intense anti-slavery sentiment I have ever read. So young Ben the historian finds this passage, and I'm elated. I have found a new, powerful, influential abolitionist voice. I'm going to follow this guy. I'm going to track the rest of his life, and I'm going to tell the story about this hidden abolitionist and the remarkable work that he did. Or so I thought. I did, in fact, track down Marsden, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what he did for the rest of his life. And frankly, it was a whole lot of nothing. Joshua Marsden never penned an anti-slavery essay. He never signed an anti-slavery petition. He never joined an anti-slavery society. He did nothing. Despite this earnest and impassioned claim about slavery's evilness and his yearning for it to be annihilated, he took no action. And I got even more frustrated when I found more folks like Marsden who would privately write these anti-slavery sentiments, but then take no action. How could this be? That is in some ways the guiding question that drove this project. Well, a couple of days later, after Marsden wrote this in his diary, he was writing a letter to kind of the coordinator of the Methodist missionary movement throughout the kind of Atlantic world, a guy by the name of Thomas Coke. And in writing to Coke, he ends the letter by suggesting that when history is written and folks consider the legacy of Thomas Coke, that his name will, quote, be recorded alongside those of Wilberforce and Clarkson. Now, if you happen to know anything about abolitionism, William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson are two of the most influential and famous abolitionists really in the world. And Marsden thought that this guy, who's really just coordinating missionaries, would be remembered as an abolitionist alongside of Wilberforce and Clarkson. How can that be? This led me to uncover an ideology that I think is essential to understanding the relationship between how American Christians understood slavery and in fact really understood their world in general and the way that you make things better. It's an ideology that I call conversionism. It's one that looks to heaven to change the situation of life on earth. It's a system that believes that it is God's actions, not human actions, that will most eradicate the evils of the world. Now, conversionism depended first on a belief in improvement. And we see this belief that the world is getting better amongst folks of very different religious opinions. I'm going to show you two influential religious thinkers of the late 18th century that frankly hated each other. The guy on the left here is Timothy Dwight. He was a conservative theologian, later became president of Yale. And the guy at the right was an English, really almost proto-atheist, freethinker, rationalist by the name of Richard Price. I'm going to read two quotes from them and see if you can notice the difference. And Timothy Dwight wrote in 1781, "It is the tendency of human affairs to be constantly progressive toward what may be termed natural perfection." Just a few years later, Richard Price wrote, "The world has hitherto been gradually improving. Such are the nature of things that this progress must continue." These guys who agreed on about nothing agreed that the world was getting better and that it would continue to get better progressively and, in fact, inevitably. So this belief that the world was getting better and would continue to get better is going to be really consequential in how people of faith thought about anti-slavery and abolition. Let me give you some examples about how this kind of conversionist ideology was then applied to the problem of slavery. In 1783, Ezra Stiles was giving a kind of a public speech about the rise of conversions that he was seeing in North America. And he wrote that because of these conversions, quote, "an unrighteous slavery may at length, in God's good providence, be abolished." He is saying that it is because the expansion of conversions is happening, that because of that, in God's providence, slavery will be abolished. It's important to note, though, when will it happen? In God's providence. is his answer. So what then should Christians do if they want to see slavery be abolished? Well, John Blair Smith addressed the Northern Missionary Society in 1797, and he proclaimed that it's the expansion of conversions that would ensure that the order and happiness of creation be best secured. He repeated this again and again, calling his audience to aid the missionary society in their efforts to, quote, obtain the increase and stability of the Redeemer's kingdom. Namely, that what Christians need to do is see salvation expand. They need to have more conversions. When that would happen, Smith says, social reform is inevitable. It was the surest, in fact, the only route to a godly social order that included the eradication of slavery. Now, after Smith gave this address, some of the people that were there were impressed and they asked him, "Can we have your permission to reprint it?" And he said no. He said no because he thought that these ideas were, in his words, so familiar and common. And he kind of worried that no one would benefit from common topics and arguments. What's interesting, though, is that what was so common for Smith and for people of this era is kind of surprising and radical and strange for us. A belief that the best way to fix the world's problems is just to get more Christians. Now, of course, not everybody agreed with this. In fact, the most important folks that rejected this idea of a kind of passive dependence upon conversion were Black Christians. Black Christians were the most consistent opponents of conversionism, and they continued to press the issue through political organizing and through confrontation again and again. In fact, in the very same month that John Blair Smith told folks that the best way to solve the problem of slavery would be to aid missionary work, that very same month, Absalom Jones, who was the founder of the very first Episcopalian congregation in the United States, he presents a petition to the United States Congress written by 4 formerly enslaved Black men, calling for the protection of formerly enslaved people and attacking the institution of slavery. So we have a white conversionist consensus of folks looking to God to solve the problems of the day, and we have Black Christians trying to take matters into their own hands and use politics and the legislature to accomplish the same thing. So we have 2 rival ideologies. We have conversionism that sees the expansion of salvation as the solution. And then we've got a smaller group, certainly Black Christians at the core, but some consequential white groups as well coming alongside in embodying what I call purificationism, a belief that before salvation can expand, the nation and its churches in particularly first had to purify themselves of the worst sins of the day, which of course was the sin of slavery. So my book kind of begins with these 2 competing ideologies, conversionism and purificationism. I run through 3 case studies on purificationism. The first is probably the most famous one that I'm not really going to talk that much about, but that is the Quakers. The most consequential group of white abolitionists in the era are Quakers. I also talk about Samuel Hopkins and a group of Calvinists in New England that again believed that if the nation didn't purify itself of slavery, that God would withhold his blessings from the country. So he emphasizes a more coercive, immediate abolitionism to protect the country from God's wrath. The third group is what I'm going to spend a minute on, and that is a group of Southern evangelicals. So our purificationists, Black Christians, Quakers, New England Calvinists, and Southern evangelicals. This guy, John Leland, is a Baptist from Virginia who in 1789 writes a petition that is then signed by hundreds, and in fact, just over 2,000 Virginia Baptists that attacks slavery as, quote, a violent deprivation of the rights of nature, and calls the institution inconsistent with Republican government. He ends this this petition by encouraging, quote, our honorable legislature to proclaim the Great Jubilee. And if they don't, he calls upon his fellow Baptists to, quote, extirpate this horrid evil from the land. So we have a group of Southern evangelicals, Baptists, and for a brief period of time, Methodists, who see slavery as a sin that has to be eliminated. Of course, what happens is the Virginia legislature does not proclaim a jubilee, great or otherwise. Leland's petition is shelved, and slavery continues. And in fact, after Gabriel's rebellion, a failed emancipation effort in the state legislature, in fact, does take action, not in criminalizing slavery, but in fact in criminalizing manumission. So as the 19th century dawns, we see Southern legislatures tighten the grip of slavery right as the cotton gin begins roaring the national slave economy into a new life. Still, John Leland dreams of what he calls a coming halcyon day, a coming day when enslaved people would, quote, march out of bondage. He in fact asks, what would be more elating than to see the power of the gospel so effectual that the names of master and slave be forever buried, every yoke broken, and the oppressed would go free? It's notable here, however, that the agent of emancipation in Leland's view is, quote, the power of the gospel. It's not legislative action, and it's certainly not abolitionist organizing. In fact, later in his life, Leland still hated slavery, but he would spend more time complaining about abolitionists than he would about the institution of slavery. So this then is why Marsden and other anti-slavery Christians did not take more action. They believed that there was a coming unfolding of salvation, which would then eventually wash away the sins of the age. But you can't really write a book about what people didn't do. You got to write about what they did do. And I argue that the actions that were taken in order to pursue salvation actually ended up catalyzing a new form of abolitionism. So in order to achieve this coming unfolding of salvation, this expansion of conversions, what we have folks like Leland and others do is knit together their churches into national American denominations. And I'll tell you, as a historian, the thought that I would be doing a history of the formation of American denominations, that's not something I'm inherently interested in, and I find it actually kind of boring. But it's important. If we want to understand the early United States, we have to understand what mattered to Americans. And even before a kind of national identity as members of the United States, or even as members of political parties mattered to folks, what mattered was their identity within churches. And these national denominational bodies create some of the first national consciousnesses in the American people. Why should someone from Vermont care about anything happening in South Carolina? They're never going to go there ever in their life. They probably will never meet anybody who has been to South Carolina. Why do they care? For many Americans, the answer was because they were fellow co-religionists in either the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian General Assembly, or the Baptist General Conference. It's these denominations that in many ways create a national identity for the United States. It really knits together and makes the nation. Now, once these denominations are made and they're created, we'll see that it then enables a turn towards social reform. But first, while we're talking about these denominational bodies, how do they respond to abolitionism? As national bodies, they hate it. In fact, my book chronicles two abolitionists, David Barrow, who was a Baptist in Kentucky, and George Bourne, a Presbyterian in Virginia. These were men who hated slavery, and they believed that the church needed to, discourage the practice. They called to kick out enslavers from congregations, and they constantly were pushing their denominational bodies to use their authority to fight against the institution. Well, in fact, what happened is the denominations used their authority to kick both men entirely out of any position of leadership. So, because the denominational bodies existed to coordinate national attempts of salvation, anything that threatened that national unity was seen as an opponent of, first of all, Christian salvation, and ironically also seen as an opponent of the process of eventual emancipation. So Barrow and Bourne, for pushing for abolitionism, are kicked out of their churches in order to protect unity, to protect salvation, and to protect the eventual emancipation that will come, or so it's promised, through God's action. Black Christians weren't having it. They recognized that slavery was, in fact, tightening its grip on the national political scene, and black denominational bodies, from the very beginning, were politicized against slavery. I already mentioned Absalom Jones, the influential Episcopalian. His fellow Philadelphian, Richard Allen, forms the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which really functions as a coordinating body for black Philadelphians, then black New Yorkers, black Baltimoreans, black folks in Charleston, all over the country. Really, it becomes an informal abolitionist network operating through the black denominational networks and the black denominational bodies. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is I see white denominational leaders originally wanting to avoid the issue of slavery. But the fact that they have to be a leader in a national network eventually will push them to have to take a stand on the issue of slavery. We'll talk about that in a minute. The process is in some ways is reversed for black Christians. That it is folks who are effective at resisting slavery get put in positions of denominational leadership. So abolitionism is at the core of what it means to be a black Christian in this period of the early US history. I want to take a step back because to talk about what happens next, we have to go back to the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, Great Britain offers freedom to any enslaved person who runs to British lines. Thousands and thousands of black Americans escape slavery through this process. And after the war, Britain actually violates its own treaty promises by refusing to return these people to slavery and instead evacuates them out of the United States beyond the reach of their former enslavers who are trying to put them back into chains, and instead evacuates them to Nova Scotia, Canada. This happens in 1783. So thousands of formerly enslaved Americans are hiding out in Canada under the protection of the British Empire before Britain carries them across the ocean in 1792 to form a colony in Sierra Leone. Now, this process is being watched very closely by Americans, both white Americans and black Americans. In 1814, Paul Cuffey, who was a wealthy black merchant, also a very deeply pious Quaker, Cuffey organizes a trip for 38 black Americans who are fed up with American racism. They are no longer willing to live in a country that not only has slavery, but has various forms of racial oppression. And he brings 38 black Americans to go and live in what is being called the Province of Freedom, this community created by formerly enslaved Americans, first brought to Canada, then brought across the ocean. So after this happens, white religious leaders decide to copy the plan. They want to create what they see as a beachhead for sending missionaries and Christianity into the African continent, and they don't want to do it under the authority of Britain. They want to do it under the authority of the United States. So, just south of Sierra Leone, the American Colonization Society, an organization really led by Presbyterian ministers, creates a colony called Liberia. Several black Christians were pretty excited by this prospect. Daniel Cooker, who was a Methodist minister in Baltimore, and Lot Carey, who was a Baptist minister in Richmond, Virginia, these two men uprooted themselves and they brought their families across the ocean to go and live in this new colonial project in West Africa. And we see other black religious leaders initially support the idea. Both Absalom Jones and Richard Allen thought that this could be a way for some Black Americans to escape, racial oppression, a way that manumissions could occur and folks could be freed from slavery. But really, most important for them was this might be a way to extend Christianity to Africa. So they organized a event where the Black Philadelphia community would gather at Richard Allen's church, Mother Bethel Church in Philadelphia, to discuss the colonization movement. And despite Absalom Jones and Richard Allen's openness and interest, Black Philadelphians said, absolutely not. The Black community in the United States was largely unequivocal in opposing this colonization movement. So this attempt to kind of, solve the problem of slavery with this kind of, impossible scheme of relocating Black Americans across the ocean is not going to play a major role in how our American Christians are going to respond to the problem of slavery. It will play a pretty key role in how both Black and white Americans will think about empire and will think about the conversion of indigenous people. But that's actually going to be my next book. We'll stay here on the question of slavery right now. So while we have a rejection of colonization, we have continuing oppressions of enslavement. In 1822, Denmark Vesey, a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that's Richard Allen's denomination, who attended the church called Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, organizes a slave rebellion. He is caught. He is killed, as are dozens of others who had something to do with, and many who had nothing to do with this conspiracy. And white Christians use this as an opportunity to take away the authority of Black Christians. We see the rise of a discourse after 1822 that says that Christianity must be in the hands of white Southerners. Black Southerners could not be religious leaders. And as accordingly, folks had to rally around the white church in order to both protect the safety of the United States and assure that true Christianity, a Christianity of obedience, not resistance, is that which is being fostered. It's worth mentioning, many of you will remember that about a decade ago, Dylan Roof, a white supremacist, attended Mother Emanuel and shot and killed 9 parishioners. He knew his history, and he was doing this as a direct response to Denmark Vesey's experience. So after this, we see this question of what actually works to generate conversions become a point of contention between abolitionists and the defenders of slavery. William Capers was a Southern Methodist minister who was approached by a wealthy planter named Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Now, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was not particularly religious himself, and in fact, he didn't really like Methodists. But he knew that it seemed like enslaved people preferred Methodist religious practice to his Episcopalianism. So he asked William Capers if Capers would come and teach his enslaved people how to be more obedient. This launches a project that Capers leads called the Methodist Mission to the Slaves, which were over a decade, starting in the late 1820s. Capers and other white Methodists would gain the approval of wealthy, powerful planters to evangelize and try to convert enslaved people into becoming Methodists and becoming Christians. It's wildly successful and will end up bolstering for Southerners a belief that slavery is what generates conversions. And if conversions solve the problems of the world, then slavery must be a good thing. So we see how the logic of conversionism, when co-opted by the Methodist Mission to the Slaves, becomes a pro-slavery institution, a pro-slavery ideology. While this is happening, and Southerners are changing their position from seeing slavery as a unjust but perhaps necessary evil to seeing it as a positive good, a good that is Christianizing the nation, Northern voices, particularly Black Northern voices, are becoming more and more confrontational. The same year that we see the Methodist Mission to the Slaves launch, we also see a black man in Boston named David Walker write an appeal, as he called it, appeal to the colored citizens of the world. This is one of the most remarkable documents in all of American history. I could really do an entire lecture just on this document, but I'm going to highlight four things that Walker says in this document. And the first one is that Americans, your revolution that you're so proud about is absurd as long as slavery continues to exist. There cannot be a free nation built on the principles of all are created equal that also holds people in slavery. The second thing he says, and this actually I think is more incendiary than the first thing, is that anyone who allows the institution of slavery to exist cannot be a Christian. That to be a Christian requires complete, unequivocal, and even confrontational rejection of the institution of slavery. Finally, he says that violence is necessary and inevitable, that God is just and God is good and God is powerful, and as a result, violence will come to this land and wash away the sin of slavery. He is calling for a purification and a purification through bloodshed. This rhetoric will start to inform other anti-slavery voices, maybe most notably the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who about a year after the release of the first edition of David Walker's appeal, begins publishing what will be the most consequential abolitionist newspaper. January of 1831, William Lloyd Garrison issues the first issue of The Liberator. And the first article in this first issue is an editorial by Garrison himself, who rejects colonization and ends his essay with, I'm going to quote from it. We see him echoing some of these themes of violence predicted by David Walker. He says, "Let Southern oppressors tremble. Let their secret abettors tremble. Let their Northern apologists tremble. Let all the enemies of the persecuted blacks tremble." That very same year, in August, trembling did indeed occur as Nat Turner and the community at Southampton, really informed by a messianic Christianity that promised deliverance, launches the most bloody slave rebellion in U.S. history in Southampton, Virginia. The backlash to Nat Turner's rebellion is swift, and it particularly attacks black churches. Black churches are shut down throughout the South, black literacy becomes criminalized, and abolitionists are now attacked as enemies of the public peace. The infrastructure for abolition grows, however. Black Christians in the North call for the formation of colored conventions, mirroring political conventions, an annual gathering where primarily religious and civic leaders can gather to organize for abolition. 2 years after this, Britain abolishes slavery in the Caribbean through a gradual act. This puts American abolitionists on their heels, as British activists are claiming the mantle of the freest nation in the world, a nation free of slavery and its empire. Americans are pushed to even greater kind of agitation. So we begin to see white Christians in the North and the South fighting against each other. Most historians pay attention primarily to a debate about how to read the Bible. Francis Wayland, then president of Brown University, and Richard Fuller, also a Baptist, both men are Baptists, in Charleston, South Carolina, exchange a series of letters that are reprinted and read fairly widely, where they argue about whether or not the Bible supports slavery or it opposes it. Now, historians have emphasized this debate. In fact, one historian, Mark Knoll, saw it as kind of the cornerstone of a book he wrote called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. Now, I actually think that the Civil War indeed was a theological crisis, but rather than this debate about how to read the Bible, what I actually think is more important is the question on who can and how should Christian conversions be promoted. Zion's Herald was the most widely read Methodist newspaper in the country. It's published out of Boston. And one of its most frequent contributors was our guy, William Capers, the founder of the Methodist Mission to the Slaves. Capers writes about his work. The editors of Zion's Herald reprints his articles and celebrates his work. Eventually, however, Zion's Herald begins publishing anti-slavery pieces. Capers responds in one editorial where he is defending slavery and highlighting the fact that it's because of the institution that his conversionist efforts were able to generate so many, incidents of salvation in the South. He is dismissed, called a sinner, and as a result, he begins publishing his own newspaper called the Southern Christian Advocate. And back and forth they go with this debate about what works to generate conversions. And in truth, Capers kind of wins because it's true that the institution of slavery did promote Christian conversion. So Zion's Herald ends up instead abandoning this rhetoric of conversion and talks about the purity required of a Christian nation and saying that Capers is a sinner and that slavery is a sinful institution. So this turn towards a kind of purification among Northern Christians extends into abolitionist strategy. When William Lloyd Garrison started publishing the Liberator, the top of the masthead said, "Our country is the world, our countrymen are mankind." In 1844, he changes it to, quote, "No union with slaveholders." Garrison and abolitionists are calling for disunion, saying that the nation, because slavery is such an important part of its economy, its politics, that the nation is sinful, and true Christians should want to remove themselves from the nation. Well, schism does come first in the nation's churches, and it comes through this collision of slavery and salvation. In 1837, Presbyterians are debating about new revival methods. That's really what's on the table, is how do you make conversions? But if we look at who votes what, every single abolitionist member of the Presbyterian General Assembly supported the new revival methods. Every major anti-abolitionist opposed it. So while this split was ostensibly and in some ways about methods of conversion, the problem of slavery had fractured Presbyterian unity, and it divided the Presbyterian Church in 1837. 1844 and 1845, the Methodist and Baptist churches will splinter more directly as a result on the issue of slavery. The Methodist Episcopal Church splinters after a Southern bishop inherits an enslaved laborer. After that happens, anti-slavery voices say that the church doctrine said that bishops, because they're in a position of leadership and vulnerability, cannot have the added obligation of thinking about an enslaved person. Southern Christians say absolutely not. He will remain a bishop, and as a result, they leave the denomination and form the Methodist Episcopal Church South. 1 year later, a missionary applies, a minister applies to be a missionary to the Baptist General Conference. He is a Southern man that has an enslaved laborer. His application is rejected, and as a result, Southerners leave the Baptist General Conference, and this is the beginning of the Southern Baptist Church, which of course endures to this day, and today is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. So slavery and salvation ripped the nation's churches apart. Henry Clay, of course, the famous legislator from Kentucky, you may be familiar with, he described this process by saying, "The sundering of religious ties, which have hitherto bound our people together, I consider the greatest source of danger in the country. If our religious men cannot live together in peace, what can be expected of politicians?" Turns out he was right. These are three Southern ministers who immediately after the split of their denominations become louder and more vocal in both defending slavery and calling Southerners to leave the United States. Benjamin Palmer, a Presbyterian in New Orleans, said it was the duty of Christian ministers, quote, "to conserve and perpetuate the institution of domestic slavery." He claimed that Northern Presbyterians were no longer Christians. they were atheists, and they were idolaters. Thornton Stringfellow wrote a widely circulated tract that said that slavery was essential to preserving, quote, human happiness and divine glory. That the very glory of God could not exist without the perpetuation of the institution of slavery. To oppose slavery would be to minimize God's divinity. James Osgood Andrew was the very Methodist who caused the split between the northern and southern factions. And James Osgood Andrew, by 1850, spends the rest of his life calling for Southern independence. He spends his life creating independent Southern educational and economic institutions and said that the South must secede if they are to obey God. And of course they did. But why did the North go to war after secession? Here again, we have to think about these religious ideologies of purification and of conversion. Henry Bellows, a minister in New York City at All Souls Church, said very simply, quote, "We go to war to save order and to save civilization." Bellows and many Americans believed that the United States was destined by God as the agent of global salvation. And if the United States would fail, so too would God's divine plan. He says, if our country be Christ's true heritage, in assailing it, he is assailed. If God is assailed, it is the obligation of Christians to rally. Abraham Lincoln will use this theme of purification in his famous rhetoric. Every drop of blood drawn from the lash shall be paid by another drawn from the sword, claiming that a national bloodletting was called to purify of this sin. And yet he promised a kind of conversionist view of the future, saying that the war was creating, quote, a new birth of freedom, a new era of salvation, not just for the United States, but for all of the world. So, how does Christianity both inspire and limit abolitionism? First, by fostering an ideology of conversionism that looks to a kind of passive belief that God will erase the sins of the world if Christians would just focus on extending salvation. But to extend salvation, Christians have to create these national networks that will eventually push its leaders towards promoting social reform. The collision around the question of who can be a carrier of salvation will rip apart the nation's churches, and after those churches are ripped apart, we then see an acceleration in the rhetoric that drives the nation towards secession and to civil war. Thank you. I would be delighted to answer any questions about this story. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ben. We have a couple of questions. First, how large of a role did events like outdoor big tent revivals impact the spread of abolitionist ideas, assuming, of course, that those types of revivals were more popular in the South?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, our kind of paradigms to talk about the history of revivalism in the United States is the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. First Great Awakening, centering in New England in the 1730s and 1740s. Second Great Awakening, upstate New York, the work of Charles Finney. In between the two, however, is in fact the largest revival in all of U.S. history to this time, the so-called Great Revival in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. So I would say when we think about these large revivals, it depends on which one. When we have the kind of revival at Cane Ridge, what is its consequence in terms of anti-slavery? I would say inconsequential, largely because it's fostering this kind of, expectation of conversionist improvement. Folks that were there, I mean, it was wild. It was dramatic. There's no way you could be within any range of this event and not feel like something cataclysmic was happening. And if something cataclysmic is happening, God is moving and God is acting. Why would you then kind of risk interrupting this spread of what creates the ultimate causation, which is divine action? So I think when we think about the Cane Ridge revival, we have that discouraging abolitionism by fostering a kind of different expectation of causation. I mentioned Charles Finney, New York attorney that has this conversion experience, and then becomes a kind of, revivalist preacher running up and down the Erie Canal. His revivals, however, absolutely definitely encouraged a coercive abolitionism. At the end of every sermon, he would have, anybody kind of desiring extra prayer to come to the front. He would point a very kind of fiery appeal at them, generate this notion of conversions. But it didn't end there. Before he would allow people to leave, he would encourage all of them to take action to fight the sins of the day. Now, mostly that was encouraging fighting alcohol by encouraging the temperance movement. But over time, Finney is persuaded more and more by his followers to take a stand against slavery. And Finneyite Christians, those that have that kind of revivalist strain, will leave their revivals with an expectation that it's their duty, if they are truly converted, to try to fight the sins of the world, including the sin of slavery. So in some ways, I wrote a book about how Christianity and maybe even sometimes the same theological beliefs are leading to opposite actions, and I think we can see that pretty clearly with tracking the kind of large revival process. It's a good question.
Great. Okay, here are some more from the audience. This question is more about what happened next. What became of conversionists after the Civil War?
Yeah. All right. This is slightly above my pay grade. I'm now, I have not done the kind of rigorous archival research to think about this, but my sense is that, Lincoln's rhetoric about a new birth of freedom and the kind of like messianic identity with the Union that drives the beginning of the war, I think kind of creates or entrenches or it had been there earlier, but creates a kind of deeper expectation that it's America's destiny to save the world. And I think we still see that rhetoric, fueling dispossession and, frankly, the genocide in the American West of the so-called Indian Wars. This notion that, manifest destiny, the expansion of American culture, particularly Protestantism, is essential for global salvation. We see it then being exported abroad with the kind of new birth of imperialism after 1898. So I think that it's ingrained in American culture that we have this kind of belief that the United States will save the world. And I think that just becomes kind of increasingly wedded to militarism after the Civil War.
That's great. That leads right into this next question. Does Dr. Wright think that passivity of conversionism survives in the passivity towards social reform and end of times religious beliefs in present day Christianity?
It's a great question. Okay. So yes and no. There's a major transformation in Protestant theology that happens in the late 19th century. Um, in this earlier period, pretty much everyone I'm talking about is what's called a post-millennialist, which means that Christ will return, Armageddon and the rapture will happen after a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. So there is this belief that kind of everybody has that the world is going to get better and better and better, and we will have 1,000 years of kind of perfection. And folks tended to think the United States would be a key part of it. By the late 19th century, we have a premillennialist theology beginning to take hold, first among fundamentalists, and then really takes hold of most Protestants. A belief that nope, the world is actually going to get worse and worse and worse, and the rapture will happen before the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And so, in a way, I think that theological shift encourages a different reason to not try to save the world from social sin and instead to just kind of save souls. If your theology tells you that institutions are inevitably going to kind of be corrupting, why bother trying to fix them? If that's your kind of idea of causation. So we have this split between liberal Protestantism and fundamentalism at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And I would say that the earlier conversionist passivity almost becomes instead just a kind of theological conviction that social change is a waste of time, and inevitably will fail.
Okay, this next question has a long statement before it, and I sent it to you in your chat if you want the context. I'm just going to read the question. It's the question is, do you have a sense of how some Black church leaders may not have been abolitionists and why? But there's context to it, and I'm going to go ahead and answer this so that the rest of the audience can see the context as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. First of all, not familiar with this incident, which happens in an 1851 convention. This is really interesting, and I would like to check it out. I would say that there is extensive debate within Black churches about what type of shape should abolitionist action take. Obviously, questions of direct confrontation are super controversial and divisive. We've got many Black religious leaders, rallying around, not just the Underground Railroad, but vigilance committees and actually encouraging physical protection of freedom seekers. We've got a robust religious doctrine that says that that's both, and not unchristian, and saying that is will be ineffectual. So I think we have a host of kind of fault lines between Black Christians on what is the best way to respond to the institution of slavery and what does it mean to be an abolitionist. Um, I think that also particularly accelerates after the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, and the fact that this is in 1851, that might be kind of consequential. There is another push of emigrationist energies of Black religious leaders removing themselves and their congregations to Canada. Because after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, it makes kind of clear that no one is really safe. We've got, people being kidnapped frequently and brought into slavery. Some folks respond to that by saying we should fight physically. Some folks respond to that by saying we should leave the United States, that it's gone. It's been surrendered to the power of the slave power. And we've got other folks saying that we should stay and remain, not fight physically, but use other methods. And folks will claim the abolitionist mantle for all of those, but in kind of micro communities, sometimes one faction will grab hold of that term, and will have those that are opposing it, therefore kind of oppose the term. I need to look into this more, and I want to, but there's maybe some possible suggestions what might be going on.
Okay. I was raised under the ethos that eternity matters most.
Mhm.
This was used in a different context in order to spur me to evangelize when I didn't want to. However, while reading your book, I kept making connections in my mind to this ethos, to what you call conversionism. I think that maybe they're just looking for a comment here.
Yes. Yeah. No, yeah. If you believe in an eternity of torment and you believe that there is any possibility that a human being could face an eternity of torment, what amount of temporary injustice and suffering and exploitation would not be irrelevant to the question of eternity? I think that we have to really reckon with that. I have a line in there that even, for the most impassioned abolitionist, if you truly believe in the possibility of an eternity of torment, the moans of a shackled enslaved person would pale before the wailings of a damned soul. So yeah, I think that you know, I I try to take seriously the beliefs of religious people, including the ones that I find kind of difficult or maybe even, that contradict my own faith. Um, and there's a kind of secularism of the academy that sometimes makes that difficult. So I had the exact same reaction too. Yeah.
You spoke about the creation of the American Christian denominations in the late 18th century, and then their schisms over slavery in the early 19th century. Do we see any similar schisms in how American Christianity is debating immigration today? It's a bit of a question of parallels, but I wonder if you see any similarities in the historical movements occurring today within American Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, I think the most notable one is actually about politics of sexuality and responses to, either female clergy or gay clergy. I mean, that issue directly is leading to schisms right now in Presbyterians and Methodists. And in fact, we're seeing the Presbyterian Church of the United States has now been eclipsed by the Presbyterian Church in America. And one of the key drivers of that factor is that the PCUSA adopted a affirming part of their church doctrine, which meant that they affirmed the lifestyle choices of gay Presbyterians, and the Presbyterian Church of America has not. Yeah, I think American Christianity is always divisive. It's always fracturing. I mean, Baptist churches are fracture apart kind of left and right constantly. And within the Baptist context, we could maybe look at the conservative takeover of the denomination that started in the 1980s. Um, I think maybe as almost an end of an era of frequent fracture because we have a kind of consolidation of resources and power that took place since then. So I think we could do it on a number of things. You mentioned immigration. That's a kind of interesting one. I think we're seeing that conflict play out maybe most notably within the Catholic Church, where we have conflicts between local parishioners and the I forgot what the term is, but the American Bishop College of Bishops or something. I'm less good on contemporary religion and certainly less good on the institutions of Catholicism. But I think yeah, we see it kind of all over the place. Frankly, though, I should say we are seeing it. The scale and the scope of these divisions have not been approached yet. Um, yeah, we see it now, but we shouldn't think that what's happening now is the worst it's ever been in terms of divisiveness. Yeah, not yet.
Um, so I'm going to ask this, but I don't know what the context is. Are you saying that thinking in terms of long-term thinking inevitably is shrinking of addressing today's this isn't okay. I'm going to ask for better context. Let's skip this one. If I appreciate the eye-opening work on the significant role played by Christians in the national division over slavery. Do you have any general thoughts on how odd it was that Abraham Lincoln, who might not have ever been a Christian, just happened to be president during the Civil War?
Um, yeah. Well, I would say Lincoln was a Christian. I think it depends on how we draw that term. I take if you have a kind of explicit evangelical interpretation, Lincoln not necessarily. But yeah, he talked about the meaning of his faith to him in a couple of kind of contexts. Maybe not as many as most of American leaders. But yeah, I mean, Lincoln was a compromise candidate. Lincoln was the guy that the Republican Party put forward because they believed he would be less divisive than Seward, who was a much more influential, respected leader. Of course, that's not the way it went, which I guess speaks to a kind of paranoia amongst Southern leaders and especially Southern religious leaders. Southerners greatly overestimated the influence of abolitionism on the Republican Party and really on the Northern populace. Um, it was a kind of, yeah, paranoid hysteria that led to the, strategic blunder of secession. The truth was, yeah, the South had had a considerable control of the federal government, especially because of the judiciary and laws that were set up. It was a blunder that surrendered that advantage with secession. So I guess what I would say, yeah, maybe I'm not answering your question, but yeah, Lincoln as a compromise candidate, and and that his kind of anti-slavery convictions really kind of came later. Especially his emancipatory instincts came later after the war began. Yeah.
Okay, I have better context to that other question. This is in reference to the eternity matters most question. Um, Thinking about eternity leads you to ignore present day injustices. Um, so in terms of long-term thinking, how does that play into um looking at it historically as well? I don't know if that makes sense.
I think
I'm
I
sorry, I'm sorry,
no.
Clayton, that I butchered your question twice now.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things we have to think about. One, not everybody actually acts in accordance with their beliefs. In fact, I think that it's almost rare when somebody is actually consistent with the context of their beliefs. So, yeah, I would never draw a kind of one-to-one correlation between somebody's theology and someone's action. Frankly, I'm not consistent with my own. Um, and I rarely meet people who are fully. But yeah, I think reckoning with a true belief in eternity, especially eternity of torment, um, requires requires a set of tools that most American historians don't have to truly reckon with that belief and its consequences. I would also say that not everybody who has that belief acts accordingly. Frankly, I think the only people that do are the type of kind of, seemingly crazy people who are running around on the street evangelizing. If you really believe in an eternity of torment, that's the only compassionate person I can imagine. Anybody who's living a life and doing a job, um, how could you reconcile that action with the reality of the future that awaits the person you're passing on the street? I don't know if that answers the question, but
Okay, so in your historian's opinion, does questioning the historical development of scripture weaken faith or can it deepen it?
wow, what a question. Man, geez, this is kind of above my pay grade. Frankly, I've had the experience of it doing both. All I can do is speak about myself here. Um, yeah, the close study of history and the close awareness of the way interpretations of scripture are historically dependent, um, challenged many beliefs that I had when I was raised. Um, I would say that studying that process can also offer different lessons and different paths. Frankly, yeah, the kind of theological crisis over the institution of slavery, um, it spawned new forms of Christianity, liberal Protestantism. It has new kind of new ways of understanding sacred text that I think have powerful spiritual truths that continue to influence the lives of many people. So I guess the short answer is it can deepen, yeah, but it's also dangerous business when you start thinking critically.
Great. I think that is a perfect way to end this. So thank you, Dr. Wright, for spending your evening with us. Thank you for all of our participants who joined us this evening. And of course, thank you to the Louisiana Endowment of the Humanities and to the state of Louisiana for supporting this particular program series. We have new programs monthly. They are all live streamed. So if you are not in Louisiana, you're welcome to join us through our live streams. But we are always welcome. You are always welcome to join us in person as well. So with that, I want to thank you all very much and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, y'all.